Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Java REST tutorial series. In this episode, we are going to be looking at the HTTP post method. We will discuss very quickly the differences between HTTP GET and HTTP post. In order to do a demo of post, I have created a quick HTML form and an AJAX request. More on this later. Once the post request has reached our Java API or our code, we need to have a way to be able to parse that data into something Java can understand. So in this demonstration, I'm going to do it in two different ways. The first option is to map it back to a Java object, and the second one is to use JSONArrays and JSONObject data types. Lastly, I will do a quick preview of episode 7, which is going to be discussing put and delete. So far in this tutorial series, we have only been using HTTP GET, and that's because we've only been really getting or requesting data from the server. With HTTP post, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be submitting data to the server. I'm sure many of you are familiar with posts from online forums. It's the same type of idea. What is important to understand is that post has a message body or a payload, whereas in HTTP GET it does not. All of your data has to be sent via the URL string. The other important thing to understand is that a browser should never cache an HTTP post request. An example of the reason why we don't do this is when you're logging into a website. So when you enter in your user ID and password, you're most likely seeing an HTTP post, and you wouldn't want that to be cached or saved to the web browser. So that's all we're going to go over right now. Let's go ahead and jump into the code. So as you can see on the screen, I've already booted up an instance of GitHub. I also have Eclipse running, and I also have a web browser. Now within GitHub, if I click on the project, you'll notice I have 3 commits that I've done. The first one is just to clean up the data source scope. So I was talking about protecting your data sources. So I went ahead and I cleaned that up for version 1 inventory and also version 1.status. These 2 commits right here are just to create that example form so that we can actually use an HTTP post. So I can show you a demonstration of that. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and sync that up to GitHub. And once that's synced up, we can actually go ahead and start working on the code. So let's go ahead and go back into the project. Now GitHub has actually changed their client a little bit. So now in order to create branches or switch branches, the button's over here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create an episode 6 branch. So I'll go ahead and create that, and that will mark the start of this episode. Again, I'm going to do all of my changes up on master. So let's go ahead and close that, and let's jump into the code. So at the end of episode 5, what we have done is we have created a bunch of resources for us to get data from our inventory table, and we have put it under v2_inventory. So today what we're going to do is we're going to start putting post methods into v2_inventory. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and write a SQL statement that will allow us to insert into our table. So that's the first thing we're going to do. So we're going to come up here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and paste a method in which it will allow us to insert into our SQL table. So as you can see up here, we're passing in all of the parameters or all of the columns in our SQL table or our database table. So let me go ahead and make it easier to read on the screen. So we're passing in title, code, maker, available, and also description. So down here, it looks very similar to when we're getting data. We're going to create our connection, except this time in our SQL statement, we're actually going to write an insert. And then we're going to go ahead and do our query parameters again. In this particular one, we actually have to convert the string variable to an integer. So that's what we're doing here, and then we're going to finish up, and this time we're going to do an execute update. Now if you'll notice down here, if everything is successful, we're going to return a integer, which is a 200. Okay, that will signify that everything is okay, that everything inserted correctly. if something were to happen and we were to enter into an exception, it's going to return a 500, which means something went wrong. And that's something we're going to have to catch when we actually create our resource in v2_inventory. So for now, that's all we need to do. We'll go ahead and save that. So now we have insert into PC parts available for us to use in our resource. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to inventory again. The first post resource we're going to create is an example of what we're going to do when we see data coming in and we're going to bind it to a Java object. So in order to do this, I want you to take a look at where your public class starts, scroll all the way down, and see where it ends. Underneath where it ends, we're going to go ahead and add in a new class, and this one is called item entry. And you'll notice inside this class we have declared a string of all of the columns inside our table. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this class and we're going to bind the data that's coming up from the request to this class. So that's how we're going to go ahead and make the data available. We're going to go ahead and use this class and bind the data to it. Now, a lot of people will tell you that you shouldn't have two classes inside one Java file, which is for the most part true, but in this particular case, just to make it easy, I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way. A lot of times, once you go ahead and move this particular class to its own package, they're called domain objects. But again, for this particular example, for this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at the bottom. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy in my post resource. And again, this is inside our public class. You'll notice that since we've never used post, we're going to have to go ahead and import in the library files that we need. Now, we haven't talked about the @consume annotation, so we're going to take a few moments to talk about that as soon as I get rid of all of these errors. We haven't talked about the object mapper either, and again, we'll talk about that after we talk about the @consume. What the @consume annotation does is that it basically restricts the type of content your Java resource is willing to handle or is willing to execute. So an example of this is that when an HTTP request comes up, within the header of that request, there's an attribute called content type. If the declared value of that content type is the same as the @consume annotation, then that HTTP request will be allowed to go through and your method will execute. The reason why the @consume annotation is important is because we want to control the type of content that comes up to our resource. For example, we cannot parse XML. So if XML was declared as a content type, then what we would do is we would send back a 404 error, or that's what the Java framework would do, because that resource actually does not exist. We don't have a resource that can parse XML and then we can bind it to a Java object. So if we were to allow any type of format to come through, we're going to get a lot of errors, and then we're going to have to deal with all those errors. This is the reason why we use the @consume annotation. It's basically like a traffic cop which sets a standard for what type of HTTP request is allowed to come through, and this is extremely important. One thing to note though, the @consume is actually looking at the attribute content type. It's not actually validating the actual data coming up. So the content type can say application.json, but if the body is still XML formatted, we're still going to generate an error because we won't be able to parse that. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what the @consume annotation does. In this particular example, we can actually consume two types of content. We can do application web forms, which is this one right here, and then we can do just strictly application.json. Now, if you only want to consume one type of content type, then what you can do is you can, let me go ahead and comment out that, you remove the curly brace, you remove the second content type with the end curly brace. So this is an example of only being able to consume just web forms. For my example, I'm just going to go ahead and stick with being able to consume both a web form and application.json, which is basically a message coming up that says I am application.json. We've already talked about the @consume or @produce annotation. So what is different now is that we have this parameter coming in, and what this parameter signifies is the payload or the message body. So I'm asking this method to bring in the entire message body as a string and call it incoming data. We declare a few variables. We also create an instance going to our schema.308 tube. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to print out the data. It's important to note that in all my examples, when we send up data, when we submit data within the message body, it's already going to be formatted in JSON format. Okay, that is the accepted standard of the web, and that's what we're going to go with. We're going to go with a standard that pretty much everybody likes to use. Now, the next two lines is completely new, so we're going to take a moment and talk about these two lines. So let's spend a few moments to talk about how we do this data binding. So what's important to understand is that the data binding, so the parsing of the JSON string and then binding it to a Java object, isn't actually a part of the Jersey framework. What Jersey does is that it bundles the Jackson framework with its framework, and this gives it the ability to parse JSON and then bind it to an object. So the real framework is called the Jackson parser or Jackson processor, whatever you like to call it, and there's the link to that particular website. And what we're going to be using is their mapper method, which will allow us to parse the JSON coming in. So the message body has our content already in JSON format, and then we're going to bind it to a Java class. So that's what we're going to do. So the first line of the code is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to go ahead and instantiate an instance of the Java or the object mapper, and then we're going to call it mapper. The second line is where all of the work comes into play. So what we're going to do is we're going to have item entry, which is going to be this class down here. So we're going to declare this class, and then we're going to use mapper, which is the variable name up here, and we're going to say read value. We're going to take the incoming data, and then we're going to map it to item entry, which is what we have declared down here. So what ends up happening is this variable right here, item entry, will now have all of the data bits from our JSON string, which came in from our HTTP request. As you can see, it's very simple to be able to use the Jackson processor to convert a JSON string into a Java object, which we can now use to pass these parameters along to insert PC parts, which is what we're doing. So now we're just going to call upon each of these strings, use them as parameters for insert PC parts, which is going to insert into our database. Now if you remember, back over here, we were going to return a 200 or a 500 for an error. So we're going to go ahead and capture that. We're just going to call it HTTP code, because that's basically what it is. If it's 200, right now what I'm doing is I'm sending back basically an empty array saying that's fine. If you want to actually send back something that's, legible, you can say item inserted, and then we'll scratch that out. But the reason why I've done it like this is for basically a future tutorial in which we're actually going to put something into that JSON array, and then we're going to string it, and that's what we're going to return. But right now this might be the easier one to understand, which we're just going to return a string down here. And basically that's really all the code that we need in order to make a post method. So let's go ahead and go down to the server. I'll go ahead and do a republish. We'll save that, and we'll see if we can get this working. Now I've mentioned that I've actually created an HTML page in which I have a form that we can submit a post request. So I've called this post.html, and there is an accompanying JavaScript file that will actually kick off the AJAX statement. So if we come down here, I'm going to go ahead and type in post.html. So here's the form right here, and as you can see, there's two buttons. Right now, the first button is for the code that we already have. So if I come in here and let me change something, say 15, and I hit the submit button, and I don't have a response back, unfortunately. Remember up here I said we will spit out the incoming data. So here's the data and what it looks like when it comes up. So as you can see, this data is actually in JSON format. So it went through and it went ahead and inserted it into our database. So how can we see that? So if we go ahead, copy that, paste that, and we go ahead and say, what was it? API v1 inventory. The very last one should be what we sent up. So let's take a quick look. What is this? Go away. Nope. And then we go to JSON lint. So if we paste that in here, you'll see the last entry row right here is what we inserted in. So I said 15 right here. So if I were to go back and I'd say 100 and I were to submit that, again I would see another submission. Refresh that. You can already see this, the next line. Trash that, paste that, and there's mine of 100. So we know the code is working. And there you go. So this is the first example of how you can use object mapping to be able to insert into your database. So let me go ahead and comment that out, and we'll save that. So that's the end of the first demo for object mapping. So let's go ahead and go to the other way, which is to use JSON arrays and to use JSON objects. Now this way, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of tutorials on it. So this is actually the way that I'm going to go with going forward for all of the other episodes. You can find plenty of examples online about object mapping because pretty much everybody has to do it in one form or another. So let's go ahead and get started on the second way. So what we're going to do, because we're going to basically recreate this method right here, and instead of overwriting this method, I want to keep it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, go to new, I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to create v3 underscore inventory. So basically I'm creating the third version of v2. So let's go ahead, go on up, do a little copying and pasting, copy that, paste that, and instead of being v2 we'll say v3, and then we'll start adding some code. Let me save this. Actually, now that I think about it, let me also do a quick commit. So I'm going to uncheck version 3 because that's going to be our next commit. So let's just say demo of JSON parser using JSON on post resource. Let me go ahead and commit that one. And the only thing left is the v3 or v3 underscore inventory, which we're not done with yet, so that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and exit out of that. So let's go ahead and start with adding some code. So let me go ahead and paste in all of the import files. So I'll just paste all of them in, and then I will paste in the method that we're going to use, or the resource. So this is the post resource we're going to use. So let's go ahead and go through it. Again, we know that we're using the post annotation. We're using the consume again and the produce. We're doing the exact same thing. We're going to bring in the body or the payload in a string format. We're going to declare some variables. This time we're going to declare a JSON object and a JSON array. So in here, what you'll notice is that the only thing that I have to do to parse the incoming data, which I declared up here, is I have to declare a JSON object, and I just named it PC parts. So in a single line, what I've done is I have consumed that the payload or the message body, and I've converted it into something that I can use inside Java. So right now, parts data has all the information or all of the data that came from that message body. So if I go ahead and do a printout of that, you'll see that it's actually kept in JSON format. So in my next line of code, I'm calling that same insert into PC parts. So it's the same insert that I'm using in schema.3082. I can reuse the same one. And what I'm doing is I'm doing parts data dot op string. And what this is basically saying is go into that JSON object and look for a key of PC parts title. And then I'm doing it for each one of these. And what it's going to do is that it's going to find the key. Remember, in JSON format, it's key value pairs. So the key would be this title right here, and it would return to me the value or the data it's holding. So that's all you really need to do. Down here, we do the same thing again. So we're looking for a 200, which means it was successful. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that JSON object, and I'm going to insert data into that JSON object by using the put method. So I'm giving it a key of HTTP code, and then I'm saying 200. I'm going to insert another one. It says message, and then I can say item has been successfully entered, and then I'm going to say version 2 because actually let's say version 3 because this is the third version of inventory. And then I'm going to go ahead and put that into our JSON array, and then I'm going to string it into a return string. So let me go ahead and do this. Let me copy that, and let me output out what return string looks like, and then we'll save that. So this is the entirety of the method. So what has changed is how I convert that JSON string into a something of Java that I can use. So it's done in one line. I'm using the opString method up here to be able to look for that key and return to me the value I need to be able to use insert PC parts. And then I'm actually using JSON objects and JSON arrays just to give you a feel for how you can use JSON objects and JSON arrays. And then I'll return it back to the user. So let's go ahead, go to the server again, and then we'll republish. And then we'll go to our web browser. So let's go ahead and do 150, and this time we'll use the second button to use JSON arrays and objects. We'll hit the submit button. You'll notice I actually took the time to output the success. So item has been successfully submitted version 3, which is basically this string right here. So let's go ahead and refresh this. We'll copy this again, trash that, paste it in, and there's our 150. Now if you look at the console, let's see, there's the data coming in JSON format, and doing this right here, this is the JSON array it outputted back right here. And if you're so inclined, you can go to the post.js file, and we'll hit the refresh button real quick. Where is the refresh button? Pull that down. So there's v2, there's our first, and there's v3. And that's what I needed to do in order to get that message and display it out to the website. So if you're interested in how the Ajax look like, you can come in and look at the post.js file. But basically, that's it. Now, in order to really go in depth into how you can use JSON objects and JSON arrays, I'm probably going to split that out into its own episode, and it's going to be completely unrelated to this series, so that I can explain it. Because basically, when you do parts data and then you do the dot, you get a whole lot of methods that you can use. What I would recommend is using the opt methods. So what you'll see is there's a version to be able to get an integer from a JSON formatted string, and then there are opt methods to actually get the string. Again, in order to get in depth into how to use JSON arrays and JSON objects, that's probably something I'm going to split out into another video. But this is the basic idea of how you can use JSON objects and JSON arrays and be able to insert into a database. And that is the end of the second demonstration. So what I'm going to do now is I'll go ahead and do that second commit that I was talking about. So let's see. Post using JSON objects and JSON arrays. Alrighty, so I've done a commit on that, and what I'm going to do now is what I've done for all the other episodes. I'm going to go ahead and take some time to do some comments on all of the new code. And if you're still kind of confused on JSON objects and JSON arrays, I'll be sure to comment pretty heavily in v3 so that hopefully it'll help you out. But I have a feeling that you know, on my project list, I'm going to have to create probably another video just on JSON objects and JSON arrays if you're interested in learning about that. A lot of people will probably stick with the object mapping method that I demonstrated in v2. For me though, I actually like using JSON arrays and JSON objects. That's because I do a lot of JavaScript on my free time. So it's something that I like to do because it sticks with the same format. When you output a JSON object or a JSON array, it's going to output looking exactly like JSON from JavaScript. So it's one type of format for my front end, which is going to be written in JavaScript, and it's also going to be the same format inside my API. It just makes things easier for me when I'm working back and forth. But again, your mileage may vary. A lot of people are used to, you know, using objects or, you know, basic objects in Java using classes, so that might be what they like. Whichever one you like, you know, you can go with. But for the rest of this project, all the other episodes will be using JSON objects and JSON arrays. So basically what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be commenting, I'm going to be updating the readme.html file, and I'll also create a GitHub tag to signify the end of episode 6. So you can see that up on GitHub once I get all of that up there. So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at put and delete. And the reason why they're put together is because they're going to be very similar to post, at least syntactically or code-wise. What we're going to be more talking about is segregation of work. In other words, what does post do that put cannot do? What does delete do that put or post cannot do? So we want to clearly define, when we actually use one of these HTTP methods, in general, what does that resource handle, what can and cannot do, what it can and cannot do. And that's more about, you know, design and architecture than it is about the actual annotation. So the next episode should be a fairly short video. Once again, thank you for your time, and to my subscribers, thank you for your support.